to this third and last of our exploratory wanderings around the subject of worship. You'll remember that our first session looked at the starting point for our journey, and we tried to define some common vocabulary, so at least we could all start with the same frame of reference and the same start point. And back then I proposed the definition of worship as being the response from the heart to being in the presence of God. Our second session looked closely at separating worship from the tools we use to worship, and in doing so taking a hard look at our motivation for worship. At times during our focus upon worship in this way, we may have felt uncomfortable with the probing questions we are considering. But every physical explorer knows there will be unnerving times during exploration. But that doesn't stop them from exploring those areas which appear most disconcerting. For today's time together, we're going to look at some of the characteristics of worship to begin to discern what worship looks like. To start, I would like to use a technique that theologians employ when trying to set context, background and nuance to a theme or a topic of study. The technique is known as the principle or the law of the first mention. It proposes that the first occasion in which a word is used is the one where its meaning and context are purest. It's a useful tool to assist us here. So let me ask, where and in what context is worship first revealed to us in Scripture? Well, you might be surprised to find that it is in Genesis, but quite late on in chapter 22. It's the time when God told Abraham to go away to one side, taking his son Isaac, and then to sacrifice him as a burnt offering. As he and the group approach the mountain of God that he has chosen, they split up. And he, that's Abraham, says to the servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go ahead. We will worship and then we will come back to you." That's Genesis 22 verse 5. It's intriguing how he uses the word worship, because from verse 2 just before, it is quite clear that Isaac is meant to be the burnt offering. There seems to be a strong interwoven connection between sacrifice and worship demonstrated here. It seems that worship not only originates from the presence of God within the heart, but seems to be fundamentally linked, at least in part, to the undergirding attitude of sacrifice. Maybe this is the antidote to one of the questions we were considering previously, around our motivation for worship and who worship is primarily for. If we have a sacrificial understanding of worship, then our focus comes off of ourselves. There's no expectation for ourselves in worship. It is just a complete giving over of self to the worship of our God. We'll consider that a little more in a moment. But what does it mean to be sacrificial in worship? May I suggest that it is to do with personal cost. Now, before you begin to worry and panic, I'm not speaking primarily of the financial cost, although I would not rule out a fiscal cost as being part of our sacrifice in worship. No, for now, I'm thinking more of the personal cost in terms of what we give of ourselves. What do we give? What do we offer in worship that comes with a cost? At a previous church, one of our number who was quite shy and definitely not a kind of up the front person asked what they might do to contribute to worship on a Sunday morning. I replied that we were very short of people who would read the lessons and the gospel. She looked horrified. She cut the conversation short and left. However, the following week she approached me again and said that she thought God had spoken to her. Now, this wasn't language that she would normally use, but she said that whilst reading her favourite book, the book of Psalms, that God had spoken through Psalm 54. And again, much to my surprise, for it was out of character, she reached into her bag and pulled out her Bible. She opened it up at Psalm 54 and read, "I will sacrifice a free will offering to you. I will praise your name, Lord, for it is good. You have delivered me from all my troubles, and my eyes have looked in triumph on all my foes." And she said that as a result of this, she felt God was saying that she should take a turn doing the readings on a Sunday. The first time she did it, the sacrificial cost to her was obvious. There were the butterflies in the stomach. In fact, I don't think they were butterflies. I think they were giant rats gnawing away at her. She stood and walked to the front. You could see the shaking of her hands as she placed the reading upon the lectern, the tremulous voice that seemed to catch in her throat as she began to speak. The simple act of reading a few verses on a Sunday morning was for her a true sacrificial act. Over time, she became proficient in the readings, and it was her testimony from Psalm 54 that God had delivered her from all her fear, the fear of reading, and other troubles, and her eyes had looked in triumph upon her foes, the foes of shyness and nervousness and fear, which had so paralysed her worship life until then. And she didn't stop just at readings, but started doing the intercessions as well, and even writing her own. She began to host her home group and occasionally shared how God spoke to her through the scriptures. You know, it's amazing what sacrificial worship does. As soon as we stop looking at ourselves and for what worship can do for us and concentrate upon Him, and when that happens, He does the most amazing things in us. We don't hear much about sacrificial worship in the Western European church today. I wonder if that says something about our wealth and our privilege and our comfortable position compared to the oppressed church seen in many places around the world. But that's another thought for another day. Let's fast forward into the New Testament and stand with Jesus as he speaks to the woman at the well, where he introduces more characteristics of worship. He says to her that true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshippers the Father seeks. He goes on, God is spirit, and his worshippers must worship in the spirit and in truth. Like most things surrounding worship, Jesus' assertion is both breathtakingly simple and deeply profound. Simple in that if we don't understand the truth of Jesus, no matter how cleverly crafted or lovingly offered our worship is, we may well be worshipping in the wrong direction. It's simple in that we must worship in the Spirit, for if we don't, we operate from the flesh. That's Jesus' observation in John chapter 3 verse 6, whilst explaining these things to Nicodemus. But these things are also incredibly profound, in the sense that Jesus here is asking us to worship with our heart, but knowing that the mind plays a part. It is in the mind where we understand the truth, but it's in the heart where that truth becomes reality in our lives. Whilst worship is a response from the heart, it is the understanding of the truth that gives us the direction that we follow in worship. It's profound also in the sense that outside of the Holy Spirit, none of this can happen. There needs to be that rebirth that Jesus speaks of with Nicodemus, that enables the Spirit within us to join with the Spirit, the same Spirit that is in God, to inspire that response in our hearts that becomes worship. When this happens, it encompasses our whole life, for the Spirit expresses himself throughout our whole life. This is not an either-or situation. It's not mind or spirit, or rather, not mind or heart. Neither is it spirit or truth, but it is both and. It is spirit and truth. Maybe we're beginning to see that worship, whilst originating in the presence of God, firing a response in our heart, doesn't stop there. It permeates all of what and who we are. Paul, writing to the Romans, seems to bring all these thoughts together as he exhorts his readers, "Therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies to be a living and holy sacrifice acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship." Paul is calling for us to worship with our whole selves, a physical act of presenting all that we are in a spiritual service to him. At the back of St. Luke's Church, we have a plaque over the door as you leave, and it proclaims the message, "The service is over, the worship now begins." I suggest that it is this sense of whole life worship that Jesus alludes to when speaking with the woman at the well and also Nicodemus. And it's also this perception that Paul encourages the Roman church towards. As a closing observation as to the direction of our worship, I repeat this story from Francis Chan, who is the founder of the Cornerstone Community Church in the United States. He tells of the time when after a service, someone approached him and complained that the worship wasn't very good that morning. Chan replied with devastating simplicity. He said, "That's okay. We weren't worshipping you." I'd like to thank you for joining me in this exploration of worship. I think we have lived up to the promise made at the start that we would not find all the answers or even agree on everything. I hope we have all made use of the items in our explorer's backpack. You remember? The open hearts, the open Bibles, and the sack full of curiosity. And I trust that where we have parted ways, it has provoked us to ask the questions of ourselves, especially the one that starts, "Why don't I accept this?" And that this has driven us up pathways and side roads where we wouldn't normally have explored, enabling us to discover what the right questions are for us. And as we close, I would like to recommend that you listen to a song of worship written by Redman. It was written in circumstances applicable to his own church, but very similar to the ones we find ourselves in today. It's called Heart of Worship, and it encapsulates much of what we have spoken about in our thinking around worship in the last 3 sessions. Please do Google it and allow it to work in your heart. But in closing, I'll just read the lyrics. When the music fades, all is stripped away, and I simply come, longing just to bring something that's of worth that will bless your heart. I'll bring you more than a song, for a song in itself is not what you have required. You search much deeper within, through the way things appear, you're looking into my heart. I'm coming back to the heart of worship, and it's all about you. It's all about you, Jesus. I'm sorry, Lord, for the things that I made it, when it's all about you. It's all about you, Jesus. King of endless worth, no one could express how much you deserve. And though I'm weak and poor, all I have is yours, every single breath. I'll bring you more than a song, for a song in itself is not what you have required. You search much deeper within. Through the way things appear, you are looking into my heart. And as we close, may I pray that God be with you.